This video is brought to you by my patrons and by viewers like you. Greetings, groovy people. Welcome to Blue Dragon Art. I'm the self-proclaimed Blue Dragon. This is an art-related channel where I talk about my comics and artwork. I talk about other indie artists and underground artists' comics and artwork. And sometimes I talk about people who are published, such as what I'm going to be doing today. And sometimes I just talk about just whatever art-related topic tickles my fancy, and every now and then I'll do like something that has absolutely nothing to do with art at all. It's basically whatever I want to do, with the precursor of the topics, generally speaking, being art-related. I'm just getting back from a very long trip. I have a video discussing that already with like an update, and since I haven't really had an opportunity to do a lot of my own work, and because I'd had this book checked out since February of this year, 2026, I just finished it on June 9th. There's a story that led up to me even discovering this author because I was unfamiliar with her. So one of my online friends regarding my channel had mentioned that it would be interesting were I to throw in a couple interviews with other comic artists on the channel. And I like that idea. I don't know when I'm going to have an opportunity to do that. So the gentleman who had suggested this to me was saying that sometimes if it's like an indie author, you never know. The worst, obviously, they're going to say is no if you reach out and ask them if they would be willing to be interviewed. And he just kind of, I don't know if he I can't remember the whole I mean, I could go back and read it. It was either in Discord or maybe on my channel. I can't remember where we were having this conversation. But he had mentioned Jessica Abel, and this is someone whom I have not heard of before. That's gonna happen, obviously. You can't know like every fucking, published graphic novelists out there, but because I think he probably threw this out there because I had been taking some comic classes regarding biography, reportage, and basically visually telling non-fiction stories. And he might have said some other people too, but this is the name that really kind of stood out to me. So back in February, I had noticed that she had actually written a book on making comics, and I checked it out. And I did not read it. The reason why I wanted to read her first was because if I reach out to someone, and you guys don't take this as me, I'm going to interview this person. However, because I don't know, I have no idea. I'm kind of dipping my toe in, but were I to interview someone, I need to know a little bit about their materials. I should go into it having some clue as to who the fuck they are and what the fuck they've written. It's just very, it's kind of rude. It's very, in my opinion, if I want to reach out to someone to just say, hey, can I interview you? And not know just go in cold feet. Absolutely knowing nothing at all about what someone's works are about. Not to say that doesn't happen, but obviously, what kind of impetus is someone going to have if you're like, hey, somebody told me to interview you, versus, hey, I've read your stuff, I'm familiar with this, I need to have a way to formulate questions, right? So I checked out the one book earlier in the year, the drawing words and writing pictures, thinking, oh, this one is really, it's going to relate to me because I'm an artist and stuff. But I kind of didn't. I'm going to go back and check it out and try to read it again. But at the time, I really was just not. It's not that it's poorly written, but it's an instruction manual, and I've got other instruction manuals, and so I took that one back and I was like, well, this is like different. It's interesting to me. I have never really listened to a ton of podcasts, but recently I have been listening to more upon the suggestions of some of my other friends. I was listening to a podcast that I can't remember the name of it because it's been like months, but it's basically women interviewing other women on stuff. One of which was like interviewing the author Samantha Irby. So I listen to podcasts sometimes, and in some ways, just having YouTube videos on in the background, even when they have visuals, to me, if I'm not looking at it, to me that kind of feels like a podcast. A lot of those are written to be both visually appealing, but also appealing to the auditory sensories, if you get my drift. So when I saw that that she had this book out on the wire, I was like, oh, well, that looks really interesting. Also, the cover art interested me because of the contrast of the color, like it's bright orange. I checked this out at the library. They had the picture of it and everything, so that's what I was looking at. And so I picked this one because that's kind of what piqued my interest. Actually, having read this, I'm going to go and read the book that is the precursor to this called Radio, an Illustrated Guide, because I just found this entire thing really fucking fascinating. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video because I haven't really had a lot of time to work on my artwork, but also I tried to like throw in a couple accessible books. I do a lot of indie reviews, or not even reviews, like indie advertisements for things that I buy where I just flip through it and say, ooh, pretty. But occasionally I'll do something such as with like Stages of Rot and Blue is the Warmest Color. I try not to dig too deep into these because I really want people to be able to go in and formulate their own experiences and thoughts. Which is sort of similar to how Glenn Washington, one of the radio show producers in this book, kind of goes about their show stories. So what I'm going to do here in this video, I'm going to try to have a little bit of structure, but not much because I am an unstructured mess. But what I'm going to do in this video is just kind of talk about this book and point out some of the things that stood out to me, some of the things that were really relatable, because one of the core themes of like all of these radio shows is that they want the stories that they share on air to be something that resonates with the listeners, with the audience. It's something that they're interested in and that they work hard to produce and want to share with people because it's their own passion. And part of the show is to like create like hooks and pulls of things that make you, the audience, just as excited about the topic as they are. And even within that sphere, there's conflicting views on whether or not you tell people what the story is or what the lesson is, if there's a lesson at all, or why it's important to you. It doesn't even have to be a lesson, but why this story is important and how it connects to you, versus the some people, not putting this rudely, this is the rude way, but trying to not insult the intelligence of the audience and letting people draw their own conclusions with, not so much telling them why it's important or why you should connect with it. It's a very fascinating read, and I just kind of want to go over some of my thoughts on it, because as an artist, I am a visual artist, right? I make comics. So my storytelling, I would think on the surface, is going to be very different from radio because they're two completely different mediums. But something that I found that I think Abel was kind of pointing out is that even though these mediums seem completely different, there's a lot more that falls in line than one would necessarily think. Because much like with a comic artist trying to create a vision in your mind, or like with a writer of literature, you are constructing a vision within someone's mind. That's the same thing that these folks in radio have to do. They have to help people be able to create a visual so that they can follow the story. They basically are painting pictures with audio, with words, with sound effects, with music. To me, it really reinforces how even when art mediums are very different, such as painting versus digital art versus a play versus a film versus literature versus radio show versus comics, they're all very different mediums, but one of the core themes that they all are intertangled with, what they all have in common is storytelling. Even if it's something that's like abstract art, there's a way to like pull a story from it, whether it's how it was created, what the artist was thinking, how these colors and shapes produce an emotion. What is the emotion they're supposed to produce? Are you supposed to just produce that feeling yourself? Is it the same as what the artist intended? Does it matter? Does it need to be? These are all things that even when something is like completely abstracted, with art, it's like, it's just something that, you know, is going to be found within any media, regardless of how it's presented to someone. So, without further ado, I just want to kind of go over Out on the Wire by Jessica Abel, the storytelling secrets of the new masters of radio. Oh, no, new. This was published in 2015, y'all. So it is no longer new. But that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, so one of the things that she basically is setting out to do is to kind of tell you in detail, more detail than her previous work, exactly how a radio show comes to be. So in order to do that, she basically has a couple chapters here. Amuse yourself, ideas. You know, you have that brainstorming session. A show begins when somebody has an idea, right? Then she goes into the heat of their breath, character and voice. Those ideas need to have some type of anchor, a character. And you don't want the characters to be so generic that they feel just boring and bland. You want everyone that is the character in the story to be unique and have their voice, yet at the same time have something that we can all relate to. Keep or kill story structure. This goes into the details of how you might get a bunch of tape. Basically, tape is when you go in and you record the interviews, the audios, the sound, the story, someone telling the story, and it might be in one order. Typically, they want things to go chronologically, but when we speak, as you all know from watching my fucking channel, people don't always speak in chronological order. They oftentimes do that to kind of ground themselves, but if they're anything like me, I bounce from one subject to the next, and then I try my best to pull it back around to the original thing that I was talking about. So when you're doing a story, you need to figure out what is interesting, what do you keep, how do you reorganize it so that it's, maybe if somebody is speaking out of order, they're bouncing around because this thought leads to that thought and that thought to this thought, and finally they're able to reconnect it. Well, you can take that tape and edit it and make a better structure, or an easier to follow structure to tell the story. And what kind of shit do you just want to fucking cut completely? Sometimes you go into a story thinking that it's one thing, but then as you actually listen to the interview, you find out that, oh, it's actually going this way. So Keep or Kill is really an interesting chapter, helping people kind of discuss and figure out how stories are actually put together, and that you can edit things around and move things about if you need to, but how regarding in radio they do that, and it seems very seamless, but the editing that gets involved, especially back when this was all like actual physical tape that they were using versus like a digital program. It reminds me of like the Beatles anthology when you hear them talk about how Tomorrow Never Knows was created and how they literally would take the physical tape and they would play it backwards, or they would do this backwards, or they would do that and add a sound effect in this way or the other. To me, this chapter was very fascinating because you're kind of seeing how the sausage is made, and in this case, because it's lettuce, not sausage. It's actually very interesting, at least to me as someone who's trying to be a storyteller themselves. The next chapter that she has was The Deep Sea, discussing sound, and I'm gonna be honest, this was my favorite chapter, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute as of to why. But following discussing sound and sound effects, she goes into and this one, you guys, this one is real. Your baby's ugly. The final edit, or the edit, not the final edit. I'm channeling some Pink Floyd here. The final cut, not the final edit. And then there's the epilogue. So I just kind of giving you an overview of all of this. She discusses a little bit in the opening, basically how this came about, both telling how the stories that the radio shows come about, but also how her creating this book came about, a little bit of that. The artwork is really fucking great. And I want to talk about that in just a minute. This is an excerpt from Radio and Illustrated Guide. This one was by her and Ira Glass, who was one of the people that she interviews. He works on a radio show, or he worked on a radio show called This American Life. So that's how, these two got together and were working on this book. But yeah, so that's kind of answering some of the questions of why is this in existence? Why is this here? She'd worked with this person in the past, and she's going deeper into it in this comic. So yeah, like I was telling you, where do stories come from? And so they kind of go into that. But the thing that I want you to really look at, something that I realized when I was reading this, is that as she's telling the story, this is basically a talking head comic. There's a fuck ton of dialogue. Look at all of this dialogue, you guys. I am, generally speaking, someone who prefers to have less dialogue in a comic. Some of my favorite comics are things like Stages of Rot, where there's fucking no dialogue, or next to no dialogue. Maybe there's like a few things here and there. So something like this, for my personality type, has a lot working against it, because while I do like to read books, I like to read novels, a lot of times I find that too much text in a comic can bog the story down. And I think that was in part, especially starting out here, you guys, this took me so long to read, in part because of helping my family move, but also it was, I'm not gonna lie, very difficult for me to get into it. Not because it isn't interesting, but because of my own mental block of, oh my fucking god, look at how much text there is. In fact, I ended up stopping at about, let me find the page where I stopped. I dropped it on page 37 back in February. I'd only gotten to page 37 because of how much text there was, and because of my attention being drawn elsewhere. However, once I got into it, this is that Glenn Washington I was mentioning earlier, but there's a whole slew of characters, real people, that are in this book, besides Ira Glass. Once I got to this part, whenever I got back to Portland, this is where I started reading and started getting way more into the book. And you notice a difference? See how much wider? Like, there's still a lot of text, don't get me wrong, but because a lot of this was an excerpt from the older book, maybe not all of it, but a good deal of it, some of it at least, I think one of the things that struck me was, and it didn't strike me until just now, until I finished the fucking book today, was that you can see how much she fucking improves just in this short period of time. And again, maybe I could be wrong. Maybe not all of this is an excerpt. I mean, she might just be pulling parts of it. However, just once she gets past all of that block of text, there's still tons of text, but it opens up a little bit and I'm given breathing room so that the pages, I picked this back up. It's June now. I picked it back up at the end of May, and I'm a slow reader anyway. I was able to fly through it, and actually I read most of this in like maybe 3 days. So that was something that I found interesting about the comic. And again, look at how text heavy it is. However, it starts to flow a lot better. And I think that something that I want to kind of point out, something that I was thinking of, is this Wally Woods 22 panels that always work. Because, like, so this is a talking head. It's all about interviews. It's all about people talking about how they talk to people and present that to other people on the air, right? And I couldn't help but think this at the end when they're talking about the edit, which is basically when people come in and critique and tear the audio piece apart until it sounds good and will capture the audience. But I noticed that, like, look at how she changes. Like, it's just very striking because, like, this is all just somebody talking and it's all just pictures, but she's able to, like, tilt the head, pull out, pull in, move body language, move the body, back and forth, back and forth. This woman looks away because she's talking about, like, how painful the critique was, how it almost made her shut down, and then she got a little bit of a compliment later on, and that really made it more passionate for her again, which I'm going to talk about a bit about the critique. But, like, just look at how this is literally just talking heads, but subtle movements. It started flowing way quicker for me, I think because of the subtle movements making it feel like I was sitting there watching this interview take place. I just wanted to kind of mention that because that reminded me of this Wally Woods 22 panels that always work, because when you're working with something that's like dialogue heavy, and it's like a conversation, this is something that to me is important as a comic writer, trying to make those discussion heavy scenes move and not bog the story down. And I really think that she maybe she wasn't looking at Wally Wood's thing, but however, I really feel like she employs body language really well here. Like, look at all the different angles. You see people from behind, you see from the front, you see from the side. It's just one of the things that she really fucking does great is she pulls you in and then you pull out. I just like that. When she pulls you in, I think that's when they're doing something called, is it signage? Where it's like kind of a bell that you need to pay attention to this. When you pull into someone's face, it pinpoints that this is a signpost. Signposting, that's it. Signposting, not signage. Signposting is a way that you indicate to people that this is something you need to pay attention to. And I think she employs that really fucking well. And just you can look at it. She makes all of this talking interesting because there's movement. It's the same background, but there's movement. This is nonfiction, but it's still telling a story, and stories need movement. One of the things that I found interesting is that while she's talking about radio throughout this book, she's applying a lot of the same theories and outlining and storytelling techniques that are discussed when making these audio shows, these radio shows. If all of that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Regarding the radio shows, like, if you're someone who is interested in how things are made, let's say you like, well, I feel like there's several TV shows, Made in America, How Things Are Made, or How Things Work, I can't remember the name of it. If you are interested in that, this book in particular, I found it entertaining and not just instructive, but like it really humanizes like the back room discussions of how things come about. Like, as someone who makes YouTube videos, you guys out there as the audience, you don't see usually what's going on in the background. You see what editing I do, what little shitty editing I do. But aside from when I occasionally talk a tiny bit about video editing, usually you guys probably, you might have an idea, but unless you do it yourself, I feel like maybe it's hard to conceptualize how much work goes into a 30-minute video, a 15-minute video. And these shows, they're taking like hours and hours of fucking interviews. Sometimes there's like I don't want to say 24 hours, but they might have like 10 hours of audio, and they've got a radio show where the story has to be 12 minutes long. 12 fucking minutes long. You don't know how much work and cutting and editing is going into the final product until you either read about it, such as with this, or until you do it yourself and you start experiencing those things that you got to do. That's kind of the nitty-gritty of what this book does. It goes through those chapters and tells you, hey, you start with a brainstorm and you get an idea. You have conversations with people, or people send in their story ideas. You might sit on it. You might think it's not going to be interesting, but then you pick it up. You hear something that reminds you of it, or something that they said in their pitch interested you and you kind of wanted to investigate that further, and you throw the ideas off of other people in the group. A lot of this is so much fucking teamwork, you guys. Sometimes whoever's working on the specific story is working alone, quote unquote, but they're really, aside from like certain parts and aspects of it, really, it's all a fucking group effort. So one person is writing things and they're getting feedback from other people, or maybe they're writing it together. Some of the shows always has like 2 or 3 people working on it. And then come the end, when they're doing the edit, the your baby's ugly part, the edit is not the same as editing. The edit is very different, because that's basically in my opinion, they call it the edit, but I call it the critique personally. And it reminds me of art college, because you're in a group and you got people who are like all in the room, like when you do like your project, like here's a good shot of that. Everybody is listening in and they're throwing in their feedback. In art, when I was in school, you'd put your work up and people do the compliment sandwich, or they don't do the compliment sandwich. They just fucking say what they think, and that's fine. Some people are harsher than others, but it's where they basically tear it apart, say what's good, say what's bad, and through that process, it's not just your baby, but it's other people's baby, and the end result is that you are able to kind of clean things up and make it as succinct and clear as possible, so that when it finally gets to the audience, who has no fucking filter, the audience, most of them do not have a filter, especially when it comes to like public shows, it's as good as it can be for the enjoyment of the viewer, the audience. And I found this to be really fucking therapeutic. Is that the word? No, there's another word that I use sometimes and I can't remember what it is. It'll come to me at the worst part possible. But to me, like this chapter, while it wasn't my favorite, the edit was, maybe because it's like the freshest in my memory, but the edit was my second favorite chapter, because it's the one that was most relatable to me, because I've been through that process. Now, I know not every artist cares to receive critique. Sometimes I don't want critique, but if you're the kind of person who, not that you can't grow on your own, but there is something of an echo chamber within your own mind. Like one of the things that people, and of course, if this takes the enjoyment out of it for you, I understand avoiding critique at all cost, that's fine. This is not me critiquing people who do not want critique. I understand that. That's not the discussion we're having. And I also want to preface that you don't have to have critique to improve. Sometimes you're just fighting against yourself to improve by your own standards, in which case you don't need the outside world's eyes scrutinizing your work. You're putting it out there because you want to find like-minded people and you don't want to fucking hear what other people have to say. That's fine. Now, we're leaving that disclaimer behind, because I'm going to talk about improvement for the general audiences. This was my second favorite chapter, because if you want to grow and be able to relate to as many people as possible and have as many people as possible even find your work accessible or understandable, you need to get the fuck out of your own head and have other people talk to you about the thing you have made. And what I mean is, as an artist, and this is something that's, reflected in this chapter and repeated in this chapter, when you write the story and you put it all together and you are presenting it, you know what your intentions are from the get-go because it's coming out of your mind. And sometimes when we're doing something, we create shortcuts in our mind because we're already familiar with the topic. I make comics, so I might talk about making comics. I'll talk about doing like the thumbnails, the breakdown, the brainstorm, blah, 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 blah. But I don't go into detail about how I get there or what inks and stuff that I use. But if you're an absolute beginner that has absolutely no fucking idea what the hell a breakdown is, whereas I know what I'm talking about when I use that terminology, somebody who is an outsider isn't gonna know what that is, and they're going to be taken out of the story if they're not told what it is. And in the time that it takes for you to, think, what the fuck is that? The story has moved on when we're talking about radio. And so it's good to have other people's ears and quote unquote eyes on a piece of work so that, your preconceived notions, this is my experience, this is my life. I assume that other people know what I'm talking about. I personally am quote unquote college educated, and I've heard these words and vocabulary and terminology my whole life or my whole student life or whatever. I throw those out into the world and I'm trying to be accessible to other people, but maybe I'm using terminology that they were not subjected to, they were not introduced to, and so if they're listening to these vocabulary words, they're looking at, drafts and all this, they're hearing all that, they might not be able to connect to that story, and I am totally unaware of it because my experience says that this is something that's familiar and commonplace to me, but it's not necessarily familiar and commonplace to somebody else. An analogy for this, or maybe a comparison I should say, is let's say someone who is in engineering or let's say biology, because there's a lot of science shows, radio shows that they discuss that are science related. I don't know all of the scientific verbiage used when we're talking about like genetics. They specifically talk a little bit about what is it? They talk about like rats. There's a show where they're discussing rats and what's the epigenetics, okay? I've never heard that word before. If a scientist is discussing this and they're just talking with all of this terminology, if an outsider who's not familiar with that terminology comes into the radio show and they don't know what the fuck epigenetics is, you're going to lose the audience, right? So that's why it's good to have different people listening in to what your show is saying, because, hey, they can stop and say, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand that, so I was taken out of the story. Basically, they're discussing, the genetic effects of parenting, being a hands-on parent, how that changes the child genetically when you are a hands-on parent in these rat communities. Basically, figuring out how to ground things and make it so that the layman can understand. That's kind of what I liked about this chapter, is because I get in my own head when I'm making my own comic. And I know that quite a few people in the indie sphere can be very resistant to criticism because, as is discussed in this chapter, it is very painful when somebody takes something that you have worked hours, maybe your whole life on, me, and people come in and because they're not in your head, they can't get into your head, and their job is to help make your vision palatable and understandable to people who are not inside your head. It is painful when they tear it apart and tell you, this makes no fucking sense. What is the point of this thing? Why do you have this in the story? You meant to say this, but this is what got across. That type of critique is very visceral. It hurts because what you've worked on, you have put hours of blood, sweat, and tears into. And to you, it makes sense in your head because you're the one constructing it. You're the one familiar with it. You know where things are going sometimes, ideally, theoretically. And for somebody else to come in and basically take your work, your baby, and tear it to shreds and say, it doesn't make fucking sense, that hurts because this is personal to me. But the goal of something like that type of criticism in the edit, or when you're receiving criticism in comics, the purpose isn't to tear you down and make you feel like shit. The purpose is to take your good idea that people feel is worth listening to that people want to read, that people want to relate to, that they want to see through. They're tearing it down so that you can make it a little more clear and have your voice better heard and understood. That is one of the things that I really liked about this specific chapter, is that it talks about how visceral this group editing is, but that the results of it is a better story that resonates with more people. The story was good, and the writing can be good, and there's parts of the writing that's good. It's worthwhile, or it wouldn't even be in that editing process, or in the edit process, in the critique process. But it can be better. Everyone can stand to improve, even if they've been doing it forever. I mean, this discussion with Ira Glass about how I've been doing this for years, and he's like, I'm a child, I'm a baby when I received this critique. My first reaction internally is to get extremely emotional and angry. I know what I'm doing. I'm good at this. How dare you say that I haven't done this right? That is a very human emotion. That is something that I myself have experienced, and that's why I really fucking liked this chapter. And yet it's something that you really, as a professional, you don't show that. And in the end, this right here is why people, I think, get angry. This panel right here, I think, is one of the best in the chapter. And I totally know that I'm completely wrong. There's no question. I'm 100% wrong. They're right and I'm wrong. It's encountering your own failure. Encountering your own failure to convey an idea or a story, that, I think, is what hurts. And we displace that anger at ourselves onto other people automatically, because on top of being hurt, you want to assign blame, and assigning blame to yourself in the immediate present tense just triples that hurt, right? It compounds that pain that you're already feeling from failing to convey what you were trying to say. And so the immediate reaction, the very human reaction, is to get angry at the person who hurt you and is forcing you to self-reflect, right? And then after you've had a little bit of time, like, that's why you don't react to it immediately. That's why you wait a little while, you roll things over, you think about what people have said, and at the end, that's when you decide whether or not you were wrong or right. And most often, a lot of times, if you're not conveying something, yeah, you probably were stuck inside your head and weren't able to convey this. Boy, this fucking whole review is just reflective of how I feel about myself, right? But yeah, I really fucking liked that chapter in particular. But my favorite chapter was the one on sounds. Oh my god, this one I found to be so fascinating. The deep sea sound. Just the deep discussion of what sound is supposed to do. It punctuates things. How people are creating sound effects. There's one talking about how he basically made like the sound of a soldier moving with like keys, a pillow, and footsteps that he recorded. Just the fascinating story of like, how do I convey somebody passing out and coming back from basically going unconscious during 0G as a pilot in a test scenario? How do I apply sound to something so incredibly abstract as I have passed out, I am coming to, I do not remember who I am or what I was doing, all I see is white. Just this whole discussion of like the audio companionship accompanying the story itself, the words itself, was just, to me, it's just so cool seeing the other side of how sound effects are constructed. And then like the way she tells it, the way she tells the story and how things, specifically of this pilot, was just so good. There's also one discussing like, how you deal with something sad like a roller coaster accident where these 3 girls lost their lives when they're thrown from this ride. How do you make it have the feels that it needs without being tacky? One thing that was particularly impactful to me was how, in trying to make sure that the scene was both interesting in the audio, punctuated by the music, punctuated by sound effects, but also still respectful of the fact that this discussion, this story, is talking about one of these girls who was flung through the ride passing away, in order to make sure that it came off tactfully and still resonating emotionally. This specific editor had to listen to that story several times, and she's like, each time it was like really painful. Like, she felt that moment several times. So I just thought that, like, just kind of the sound effects section was particularly interesting to me for that reason. I just had a couple side notes that I wanted to talk about. But yeah, I just had a couple other thoughts that I wanted to kind of put out there that kind of came up while I was reading this book. Things that had absolutely, well, some of it may have had something to do with the book, the graphic novel, and some of it was just thoughts that, you know, when you're reading things, your mind just kind of meanders. This in particular just popped up in my head. I think why this came up was because of her really good use of contrast, her really good use of visual storytelling. Like, you know, sometimes it's just all black. Sometimes she's got the white lines to kind of depict things. Sometimes she's got lighting and shadow, whatever. Just the way she was able to draw these images got me thinking. Again, this is like a total random thought that has nothing at all to do with this, the topic of this book. But within the comic community, every now and then there'll be a thread that pops up. Do you like color comics or black and white comics better? Or are color comics superior to black and white comics? And to me, the answer is neither is superior, neither is better. I like color comics, I like black and white comics. I do, however, one thing that I do know about myself is, so it's probably not a secret that most of my life I have preferred manga to American comics. And that's because when I was younger, I thought that when it came to American comics, I had the choice of Superman comics, and that was it. You know, like superhero, I should say. And I'm not shitting on superhero comics. Aside from X-Men and maybe a couple other things, like I did like Spawn. For the most part, American comics, when I was younger, didn't really... Like, I didn't dislike them. My mom loved comics, so, like, I liked comics, and I liked the comics that my mom liked, because my mom liked those comics, and that's what she had. But when I started discovering comics on my own, I discovered manga, and I felt like the story kind of resonated with me more. But if you know anything about manga versus, you know, superhero comics are full color, and they have definitely changed over time. But, I mean, I get that, like, modern graphic novels that are superhero themed, the coloring is far different from, like, that stereotype in my mind of, like, the 90s comics, which weren't even bad. I'm just saying, like, the thing about manga is that aside from, like, special pages, they're black and white. To me, that was my first introduction to black and white comics versus color comics. Now, if I'd known any better, as a young kid, I didn't know about Mouse. I didn't know about, you know, shit that was done by Joe Sacco. I didn't know about works done even by fucking R. Crumb, because I like R. Crumb, and but I've never, like, read... I need to read some of his actual books. I know that he's a very controversial subject, and I know that a lot of what he says I am not going to agree with. But, you know, that's not what I was thinking of as comics when I was a kid. Even though Mom had Life in Hell, you know, by Matt Groening, we had that, and it's black and white. But I don't know why, but I always ever just, when I thought about comics, my mind went to superhero comics, and that's it. Now, having all that set up was for a reason. Here I'm meandering back. I have noticed that a lot of graphic novels that I like are monochromatic, either black and white, or if it's something like Alison Bechdel, it's like a monocolor blue in the case of Fun Home that has like washes and stuff, and a lot of hatching. I don't sit on either side of the color debate, because I do have a great appreciation as somebody who loves like psychedelic colors, and I sometimes work on a psychedelically colored comic. I don't think one is better than the other, but I was just thinking as I was reading this earlier today One thing I think is interesting about this comic is because it's in black and white, like even characters, even they're not characters, they're real people. They're characters, but they're people. Even people that I can tell are coded as being, darker complected. Like this person, I believe, is darker complected. These characters are definitely black, right? They're talking about this woman who gets into boxing, telling this story on, I snapped Judgment. I was just kind of thinking, I was like, oh, okay, she does a really good job of like conveying that these people are darker complected, even without filling in their skin tone, which, as somebody who reads manga, there is a reason why I'm talking about this, you guys. A lot of times manga artists, like sometimes they'll have characters where their hair is all inked in, but to save ink, a lot of times that ink is left out and your mind fills in the blank that person's hair is black. She was employing like a similar thing for like her characters of color. Instead of like doing a wash or filling it in, she just drew their features and was able to convey that this is a person of color. This person is darker complected than some of these other characters. Other people, I shouldn't say characters. And while I was kind of thinking this, it was just kind of in the back of my mind, then I started thinking about like color comics and like color theory and how when an independent comic artist or anyone, any comic artist or the colorist, a lot of times it's not the comic artists themselves in Western comics doing the coloring. And even in Eastern, I shouldn't say that because I don't think, like occasionally Hirohiko Araki does some of his own colors, but a lot of times somebody else is coloring it. So it's not just, I shouldn't say Western, I should, it's the same in other countries, in the East too. But I digress, oh my God. And probably in the South, in the global South probably too, whoever's doing comics. But at any rate, I was thinking, how important like color theory is, but and how like mixing, maybe you do a complementary color scheme or you do this or that. And then I was thinking, I was like, holy shit, my partner is colorblind. So as careful as I am and other people are when they're doing, this is how my mind works, you guys. It just kind of meanders around, okay? I'm giving you a little insight of the stupid jumps that I do in my head. But I was thinking the best laid plans of mice and men, you try to make it clear and you use this color theory to convey meaning and to elicit emotions, but sometimes that intention fails because as we're in our own heads, if you're someone who is not colorblind or does not know someone who's colorblind, you may not be thinking about that when you're doing your colors. And so you'll put these colors next to each other and what looks as very striking to you is maybe not going to be picked up by someone who is red-green colorblind or yellow-blue colorblind, whatever other forms of colorblind. And so that got me thinking, one of the reasons why I think black and white comics are kind of, for me, I'm not colorblind, so it's not really here nor there for me, but I jumped to like the video game thing and how there are oftentimes colorblind versions of video games. If you don't know this is something that my partner sometimes has to turn on in some games because if there's a lot of green and red, it's all muddy and it all looks the same if you're not careful about how you use your contrast. I'm not going to go into how he sees colors, but I will say he can tell between, some red and green, very intense colors on the spectrum. But at any rate, that's not always something that a colorist is thinking about when they're making it. So that led me to the thought, well, that's kind of one of the things that's great about black and white comics is that there is no color, obviously. And so all of the value and the highlights, all of that contrast, it has to be done with just those two colors. Duh, I'm a genius, right? But actually, when you're thinking about that, like the grays and stuff, there's some grays here on this page. A very successful artist is able to use just two colors or two lack thereof, just the two, I'm going to say color, but it's the color and the lack thereof to convey their message. So I was just kind of admiring that about this comic was that, she, as well as many other comic artists who work in black and white, because their palette is so limited, they have to find a shorthand, or they have to find ways to make their images striking. And something that I think about when I'm making my own comic, not always, but it's something that I think about. How do you make a panel stand out? How do you make it interesting? I use hatching, or I use stippling, or I use stark black against white. It's just something that I was thinking about when I was reading. I don't know, just a thought, you guys. It's neither here nor there, and it has absolutely nothing to do with this comic. But as a comic artist myself, this fucking book talking about radio shows made me think about my own art and how to construct and convey and create visuals, you know? One of the things that I found fascinating during the sound section, I was thinking about like how dude was using pillows and footsteps and keys to make the sound of a soldier. That led me to think, so my partner, he's working on a video game. A Mud is like a very old school type video game, but it's like a cyberpunk type thing. He can't do everything. He's working on the visuals, he's working on the story, well, kind of loosely working on the story and characters, things that are going to be in it. He's working on the coding, and his brother is really good at mixing sounds and creating sounds. And maybe that was my personal connection with this chapter talking about sounds. I thought this was very interesting because they're discussing, different places where they got free sounds. As Bradman was telling me about how his brother comes up with some of these sound effects, and I thought that it was just kind of cool seeing that like other people do like similar things. Like this guy needed something to sound like the cracking of a cold pipe in Michigan, and how they were doing the sound effects, or they needed to make something sound like flesh being burnt or something like that down here. Oh my God. But yeah, it was just fascinating to me how a lot like folio work, it's just fascinating. I don't know a lot about folio work, but they're basically, some of these engineers are creating their own folios for the radio show because it's quicker than doing the hunt. And that was something I can relate to, because sometimes it is just quicker to make something from scratch than I've spent hours searching for music or this or that or whatever it is I want to put into the video that I cannot create myself. It's got to be unlicensed. It's got to be something that I can use. And I've got to be able to find what it is. And every now and then you know exactly what you want. And if you can figure out how to do it yourself, that can sometimes be quicker. I think that's part of why this specific chapter connected with me, because just hearing like my partner talk, like his brothers talked to me about it before too, a little bit, but like just hearing somebody else doing a similar thing, I was able to connect that in my own life. Something else that I was thinking about, I don't know if I wrote this down. Oh yeah, I did. This chapter talking about just how, again, these are just random thoughts. This end part of the video has nothing to do with it, but I was just thinking, look at how deeply ingrained in our culture comic books, superhero comic books are. That this book has absolutely nothing to do with comics. It is not really discussing comics aside from the author and the epilogue reflecting on like her own process and how, writing this was so incredibly similar to the process that these radio show producers and hosts go through. Other than that, this really didn't have anything to do with like nothing to do with superhero comic books at all. But yet it's so ingrained in our culture. Just random thought. I was like, oh, with great power comes great responsibility. Here, and this looks like a Hulk, reference. It's interesting to me, the shorthand that she uses in this comic that is inspired by somebody who is not in comics discussing their process. Just a random thought. Neither here nor there, has nothing to do with anything. Just sometimes I like to share the stupid little things that blip into my mind. Just how ingrained into our culture comics, a medium for children, can be. I mean, it really isn't just for children. I mean, maybe you don't necessarily, I know Alan Moore's feelings on superheroes. But, there's other types of comics and graphic storytelling. I feel like comics and graphic novels being the hoity-toity term for comics. I feel like they're getting a larger appreciation and they're making more headway in literature. I mean, especially since in college we read The Crow. Like, my American Gothic professor had us read and watch The Crow. So, they are starting to gain more respect. But I think there's still a long way to go before people really like will look at the medium as a form of art and literature, not just as things for kids. Random thought, has nothing to do with this, but this is the shit. This is how my stupid brain works. This is my brain at work. So I wrote down this thought. This comic is visually discussing an audio medium that's working to input visuals into your mind through words, sound, and music. Now, I mentioned that earlier in this video. I tried to find a way to incorporate that more naturally, but this was a thought I had when I was in a cafe earlier today, finishing up the book. Yeah, it's just, to me, it feels a little, maybe not meta. Is meta the right word? Meta or inception? It's just interesting to me, like that whole concept of people trying to use words to paint visuals in the mind versus a comic medium where they're putting the story in your mind through pictures. Just kind of a weird thing I was thinking about. That's why I saved this for the end of the fucking video, because it has nothing really much to do with this, with the topic of this. Okay, epilogue. The epilogue of this I really like because it kind of connects the mediums, as I was discussing earlier, how all artistic mediums, be it music or whatever, getting in the weeds of it, creating art, even if they're different mediums, really there are threads that connect all human art together, no matter what medium it is. And so in the epilogue, Abel basically is discussing how, much like a lot of the storytellers in the radio world find themselves lost by the time the finished quote-unquote product comes out, it's just seamless, and you don't see that. Much like how they also get in the weeds and have to find their way out of this maze. All these fucking metaphors. The same was true for her when she was writing this book, and the way she got out of it was by rereading the book, by rereading her work and her notes, and trying to use the suggestions, the guide work, that the backbone basically that was laid out by the radio show, basically taking that and applying it to her own work as a comic artist, with the help of editors, of course. And then it has a very nice ending, a very nice visual. I like this visual for a couple of reasons. One, it's because of the title, Out on the Wire, The Wire, that I believe comes from like how radio shows used to be conveyed. But also, you're kind of walking a tightrope. You're trying to find a balance when you're creating any piece of art. It just seems like such a simple visual, but it's very striking. Again, it's opened up a lot more. There's absolutely no text here at all. She takes what she wants to convey, and no words need to be said. You can look at this and tell exactly what she's talking about. She's walking a tightrope. She's walking a fine line. She is on the wire. Finding the balance to convey the story. I like this. I don't need to tell you the story. Oh my god. I just did the thing that Glenn Washington hates. Glenn Washington, okay, I mentioned Glenn Washington. Okay, I gotta bring it back. Glenn Washington, I told you, was one of the producers on Snap Judgment, but there was also Radiolab that they were discussing. I forget what the money one is. Well, there was a story on it called The Giant Pool of Money, which was discussing the shit that led up to the housing market crash. Planet Money, here it is, I found it. But yeah, Glenn Washington, towards the end of the book, there's a lot with him discussing their process on how they do the Snap Judgment show. He was very much, do not tell people the lesson of the story. Let people form their own thoughts. You don't need to hold their hands. Let them come to the conclusion themselves, because otherwise they've got this vision of what the moral of the story is in their head. But if you come over and tell them what it is, one, it could clash with what they thought, and two, it could just be jarring, like, you told me what to think. I don't like to be told what to think, because that's how people are quite often, right? But then there's like some of the other people, the other producers on other shows that are like, but we need to make sure people know why this is interesting, why it's important. It's just funny to me. It's funny to see how she encapsulates through their own words, the importance of telling stories, why they find these specific elements important. And then you've got this one person who's like, nah, man, that is not what I find important at all. I hate that when people are telling a story and they Dr. Laura me and tell me, Dear Abby me, and tell me what I'm supposed to think or what I'm supposed to do and blah, blah, blah. I get it, though. I get it. Sometimes you just want to hear the story. So I don't know where I sit. I like both forms of storytelling. I personally don't like to be talked down to. I know Brad doesn't. But at the same time, sometimes I'm sitting there, Sometimes I need to be told what the fucking lesson of the story is, or what the teller of the story believed their lesson was, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, so, wow, those are my very disjointed thoughts on Out on the Wire. Can you tell by the fact that I'm really doing kind of an in-depth discussion of my thoughts on this that I enjoyed this book? Once I got past that initial part, I would definitely recommend this to people who are curious. All right, thank you all for listening. I don't know what's coming next. I'm just whimsical like that. Until next time, peace and love. Fare you well, and keep on trucking. A lot of times we think that it's just the fucking moiter dots, what is that called when it's like the different colored dots? I can't remember. Moira, not moiter. What the fuck? Moiter? That's the that's the cross section of goiters and dots. A moitering effect. Moiraing effect. Oh my god, you guys. Can't know. Ew, gross.